Teen and Amar stood in Balchi Square. Small shops were jammed into every available bit of space. Barefoot boys strained as they pulled carts with goods for delivery. Poor women, draped in faded wraps, stood in groups chatting or in deep negotiations with sellers of carrots and onions. A barefoot man in short surwal and a moth-eaten woolen wrap thrown around his shoulders sat beside a careful pile of dung patties, hawking, "Fire! Dung! Fire!" They had walked around the square twice and still had not seen a greengrocer by Nouri's description. Amar asked, "You said this was a trustworthy lead." "Yes." Teen's eye was on the tavern on the far side of the square. A tall man with a black turban pulled his head back quickly inside to avoid being seen. It was a watchman sneaking a drink on duty. He thought, "I wish I were with you, brother." Amar tapped Teen on the arm and pointed to one of the produce stalls. There he was, emerging from the back of his shop. The grocer waved the woman who had been tending it through the door and shut it behind her. He was a middle-aged man, slim as a post, but average in every other way, except for that he was wearing a comically large green and blue turban. Worse, he wore it around a conical green quilted cap, like a judge. Amar laughed. "Fits the description." "Yes, he does." Amar strode over to the shop, hand on the hilt of his sword. Teen hurried behind him. The grocer didn't have a second to think or run. "Baghdad grave crimes. We're looking for a Turkmen curse writer. You aren't in any trouble if you help us find her." The grocer lifted both hands in submission. He backed up slowly between the nearly empty boxes holding his produce, a few withered-looking carrots, leeks, onions, and garlic, yelling, "I don't know where that horror of a woman is. If I knew, I would hand her over to you myself. She drove my wife out of my arms and back to her family with her curses." Amar followed him in, crowding him against the door to the back room. "You must know something. Tell us, and we can handle her for you. You'll not be bothered by her again." The man lowered his voice, glancing at the shop on his left. "I told you, I don't know where she is. She only held off destroying my business because I agreed to let my woman go." Then loudly, "I don't know where she is." Teen leaned over the stacked boxes. "Who is it over there that you want to hear your protests?" The man's face drained of color. His eyes opened wide. He ticked his head to the left without saying anything. Amar looked back at Teen, who nodded and stepped out of the shop. Amar stayed with the grocer while Teen scanned the square to read the situation. The grain seller to the grocer's left looked like he was ignoring them, but he was observing their movements well enough. He was leaning against a barrel, using a tip of a small dagger to clean his nails. The narrow sleeves of his short robe were rolled up, and his knife belt kept his robe close to his body. Nothing to get in the way of a fight. Teen could see by his stance and the natural yet controlled way he held the knife that he knew how to use it. He was protecting someone within. Teen stepped back into the greengrocer's shop. The door at the back cracked open. A woman's arm came out and slapped at the grocer's arm, trying to get a hold of his sleeve to pull him into the back room. Amar took hold of his other arm. "What was this about your wife being driven off?" The man whispered, "This is my second wife, now my only wife, thanks to that sorceress." "Ah." Amar addressed the woman behind the door. "Let him go. We're not going to bother him. In fact, I'd like to buy some carrots for my own wife, who, as it happens, has not left me." The woman pulled her hand back and shut the door. The grocer sidestepped past Amar to one of the stacked boxes. "How many would you like? I can give you a good price, thanks to your service." "I've changed my mind. I've changed my mind about having a wife, too," Amar said in a clear voice as he left the shop. "You let us know if you hear anything. Tell any watchman. Tell them to take the news to grave crimes by the Basra Gate." Teen and Amar stood at the shop's edge of the square. Teen knew Amar would have seen the grain seller's knife. They approached his stall, understanding their roles without having to say a word. Amar stopped where he could fall back with one step and pull his sword from its scabbard. His hand was not on the hilt, but it could be in the barest of a second. Teen held back. He could move in any direction to apprehend the man if he decided to push past one of his barrels into the square or take on Amar. He hoped there was no laneway behind the shop, but that was unlikely in this neighborhood. More likely, all he had back there was one room with no windows and light that he used to store goods or sleep if he had nothing else. Amar asked the grain seller, "How's business?" The man stood up, relaxed still, his arms beside him, but had turned the knife around in his hand, pointing behind him so he could stab down or slice across in tight quarters.
Dr. Laury Silvers, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited. I've heard your other podcasts, and they are terrific, and I'm looking forward to being a part of this.
You are too kind. Can you just spend a moment and introduce yourself to the audience however you see fit?
Yeah, so let's see. I would call myself an accidental academic, an accidental activist, and now an accidental novelist. I sort of tend to fall into things in life. Somebody once talked about sort of doing things to have a story, and I kind of took that as a life mandate, and I've ended up just sort of jumping off into things without knowing, what I was doing or what I was going to do next. I was trying to get a degree to teach high school English when I was an undergrad, and William Chittick, who's a specialist in Ibn al-Arabi, was teaching a class that I needed to take to graduate, a study of another culture course. And I did really well reading Ibn al-Arabi, apparently better than the grad students who were working with him, as he told me later. And he said, "I want you to be my graduate student." I had no language skills. I had never studied religion. I didn't know anything at all. As a matter of fact, I was sort of overall, you had a C average and a B average in my, a B average only in my, in English lit, English and American lit, which was what I was saying. And he said, "I'll get you in. We'll do that." And that it was a different time, right, where that sort of thing could happen. So I sort of accidentally ended up becoming an academic. And by virtue of academia being what it is, I, ended up not teaching anymore. And now here I am, accidentally writing novels, and sort of fell into the activism I did accidentally as well, where people just sort of invite me to do a thing, and I'd be like, "Do that." "Okay, I'll do that." Or I'd get angry about something and be like, "Let's do this thing." And the next thing you know, I'm helping to found, one of the first gender equal LGBTQ open mosques in the world, if not the first, a public one anyway. It just happened. Stuff just happens to me. I don't really actually try.
Wow, amazing. I'm curious as well about a little bit about your academic areas of expertise, like any positions you may have held as an academic. Tell me a little bit more about the academia side.
Yeah, I think, I had a temporary job in my last year of graduate school, and one of those sort of temporary positions where you're filling in for somebody while they're away for the year, and that's when 9/11 happened. And I was just starting to go on the job market, and there were no jobs. And then 9/11 happened, and then all of a sudden all these jobs were turned into Islam jobs. And there were not enough of us to actually fill all those positions. I'm not sure that I would have gotten a job straight out of graduate school, because my advisor was very old-fashioned and didn't think that his graduate students should publish.
Okay.
So that actually is bad advice.
Yes, terrible.
He's super old school. So, he just is like, you shouldn't publish until you're 60 kind of thing, when you finally know something. I'm exaggerating, but he was an amazing advisor, but that one piece of advice was not useful. And so I don't think I would have gotten a job straight out. So I did end up getting a job, and I got a short-term job that turned into a tenure track position. And then in the middle of that tenure track position, following various life events, I fell in love with this guy in Canada and came up here on sabbatical and didn't want to leave. And I talked to a bunch of my colleagues, and they said, "You go be happy.
Yeah.
You quit your job and go be happy." And they just said, just continue to publish and to be part of the American Academy of Religion. I was a very active member of the American Academy of Religion. I helped to found the Islamic Mysticism group, and then was its co-chair later. And I was always active and loud at the AAR. So I was always that person sort of asking an uncomfortable question, and it's sort of things that I look back on now and are actually a bit sort of ashamed about. I didn't have a good sense of propriety back then. Sometimes I joke about, sort of my rage years, and those were part of my rage years anyway. So I feel bad about all that, but people still talk to me, so it should be okay. I think
Would
it
you
turned out all right.
would you describe yourself as a scholar of Islamic mysticism? Is that sort of how you would
Yeah, thank you for redirecting me. So yeah, so I ended so I'm a scholar. I'm sorry, I'm a scholar of Islamic mysticism. So yeah, I worked with William Chittick on I read Ibn al-Arabi and Rumi with him and some other sources, and I ended up Gerhard Bovering at Yale ended up giving me the topic of my dissertation, an early mystic, an early Sufi named Abu Bakr al-Wasiti, who's also the topic of my first book, and that really led me to working on early Sufism and the very, very early period. So I worked on that alone. Actually, like the year 1000 for me is very, very late.
Mm.
I worked on early piety and very early Sufism. I didn't go much further than that. And then that developed over time, working on the early Baghdad Sufi community. That developed over time to looking at looking at gender and early women, as I was reading all these biographical notices and seeing how women were showing up in these very early sources compared to how they were showing up in later sources, and what the early community was like socially. And it's very, very different from what we would assume. If you look at the later sources, you would think that there were no to very few Sufi women at all, and you would think that Sufi women were never teachers, and you would think, except for in a very, very rare exceptional case. And we can see from the early sources, that the very earliest sources, that women were teaching men and women in gender mixed environments. Women were studying with male teachers. It was this very mixed, open environment. It's the beginning of Sufism before it had institutionalized, and really the charisma and wisdom of a person is what drew people to them. And so I started working on trying to retrieve those stories and talk also too about some of the uncomfortable matters about their social world. I started getting more into social history and thinking about what were the social realities of these people and what can we get from these sources. So I started reading further afield in order to do the social history of the time. So I have a piece in the Cambridge Companion to Sufism, which is the last academic thing I've written, which sort of sums up all the research I've been doing on the social world of these women and how their social world affected the way in which they express their love of God and their worship of God. I think people, we tended to sort of think about worship of God in this very decontextualized, socially decontextualized way. And I wanted to show how their social world, everybody's social world, not just the women, but hopefully people could make that bridge from it, but that their social world actually affected the way they viewed God, the way that they loved God, the amount of time that they would have to pray. If a woman has children and a family to take care of, then unlike a man, she is not spending the entire night in prayer awake, because she has stuff she has to do. So she only is spending a portion of the night in prayer, if much of that at all. Her worship and her work is set around the life of her family. People who were enslaved, their worship was set according to the fact that that their time was not their own. Their labor was not their own. And so how did they manage their worship? So how did they do this? Wandering women, what were their lives like? And that's sort of what led me sort of to imagining these worlds, led me to ultimately be able to write fiction about this time, was because when you stop thinking about Sufism in this socially decontextualized way, you start thinking about the worlds these people inhabited, then to me it's impossible not to imagine those worlds and be world building in your mind. you can't write something about what these people experienced or be able to read the accounts of their lives with an eye to their lived experience or the lived experience that transmitters are claiming for them, without imagining what it would be like to be a woman who is mad in love with God, wandering alone across, across the empire.
Mm.
So what would have happened to her? And there's no question in my mind, after reading tons of material about crime statistics and what things were like on the road for people, that a woman alone would not have been. She would absolutely have been raped. There's no question about it.
Mm.
And so, and so then reading stories about these women and the way they articulate their experience, made me realize they're talking about more than just God. They're also talking about the kind of trust that they have in God, despite, or not despite, or maybe with the lived experience, which could be quite harsh. So really sort of thinking all these things through, led me to, allowed me to imagine a fictional world. And in particular, sort of thinking, one of the things I was thinking about when I was reading about these women is, what would it be like to have a mother like this?
Mm.
What would it be like to be the child of a woman who loved God more than they loved you,
Mm.
right? For whom love of God was everything. And they love you, sure, but you are not their God. God
Mm.
is their God. And I think most parents, their children become small gods, become little gods for them, that without which they cannot survive. And this sort of world around which they circle, like your children become your Kaaba, around which you circle. And for these women, that was not the case.
Oh,
And
wow.
so what would it be for a child to not have that feeling of devotion from your mother?
Mm.
And then, in the case of Teen and Zaytuna's mother, who is one of these great Sufi saints, and I base her on Shawana, who is a black saint, who would lead these public and private gatherings of men and women alike, and drive people into ecstasy until they were in tears and dancing, and and completely overwhelmed. And I base her mainly on her, but I also take her dialogue from other accounts of other Sufi women. And so what would it be like to be a child of a woman who is in a graveyard, which is where many women taught,
Mm.
teaching in a graveyard, sitting in your mother's lap as she goes into ecstasy, and people around her go into ecstasy and into a slight madness with her? Like, how terrifying would this be?
Oh, my
So
goodness.
I really sort of wanted to tell, I ultimately, sort of felt like I wanted to tell the story of these people who are barely in the sources. I mean, if the women are barely in the sources, their children are barely in the sources.
Mm.
Just a sliver of that. And that sort of led to me, thinking about them that way.
Interesting. Well, okay, so you and I have been communicating for some time now online prior to doing this conversation, and I also know that you have like a spiritual connection as well
Yeah.
within Islam. Can you talk a little bit about your spiritual trajectory, just as an individual, and then if there was any overlap between your academic area of interest developing alongside of that, or if those were two totally separate things?
No, so they're connected, but they're also in tension with one another. So this is a good question. Let me see if I can articulate this. So I ended up becoming Muslim because of reading Ibn al-Arabi. So the class I took with Chittick as an undergraduate was his book Sufi Path of Knowledge, and I read that, and I was like, okay, stick a fork in me, I'm done.
Mm.
This is everything I want. And I practiced Islam secretly for a couple of years, because I wasn't sure if I could do it,
Right.
and I wanted to be able to do it, and I did that, and I read Ibn al-Arabi very, very closely, and I tried to read a lot of other sources, and tried to sort of get into it more and more, and that entered into graduate school, and so I came to Islam through Sufism.
Mm.
And I didn't have a Sufi sheikh for a long time, for a while. It took until I was sort of in the very end of a trip to Morocco, a 2-year-long trip to Morocco where I went to study Arabic, that I met my first sheikh, and started to get some practical guidance in that context, and to have that kind of one-on-one connection with somebody. But then I left Morocco, and so I didn't have a sheikh on hand again. I still had that connection, that spiritual connection was there, but it's not the same thing as having face-to-face conversation with somebody. And it wouldn't be for years later until actually I came to Toronto that I found another sheikh. So I was sort of on my own in a lot of ways with my mysticism, and trying to do the best I can. At the time that that I came to Islam, I ended up, as many converts do, becoming more conservative than perhaps is my actual sense of who I am and what I am, and took on a lot of conservative values and a lot of conservative ideas, and not even, I don't want to say that they're not traditional, because as a historian, I realize that these ideas aren't traditional. They're actually very modern. So we now call sort of American, North American and European Islam that sort of remembers the past in a very particular way, neo-traditionalist, because it's not actually traditional. It's neo-traditionalist. It's a take on tradition, and it's a kind of romanticization of the past, and a kind of unity of discourse, a kind of unity of vision, and let's be perfectly clear, one that sidelines women, one that sidelines everybody, one that looks at the past, never asks the hard questions about the past, and doesn't want to see, has I'm not going to say doesn't want to see, but has great discomfort with the diversity of the past. I mean, academics of Islamic studies know that it took hundreds of years for alcohol to really be absolutely forbidden, but that there were debates about it going on, not just popular use. I mean, you can say, Muslims don't drink, and that's true. That's, yeah, legally there's consensus now, absolutely, Muslims do not drink alcohol, but that doesn't mean that Muslims don't drink alcohol. Tons of Muslims drink alcohol, right? So the world is filled with Muslims who drink alcohol. But it's wrong. But back then, really early on, this wasn't entirely clear, right? So, but this is not to say that people did not think it was a wrong or bad thing. People absolutely thought it was a wrong or bad thing, but the legalities of it were in some minor ways in dispute over things. So it wasn't quite the feeling we have now. But what neo-traditionalists do is that they see this consensus about alcohol that is absolute right now, and they put it onto the past as though it were absolute back then.
Gotcha.
And so they do this with everything. And so one of the, I'm not sure if I'm going to be, this is answering your question, but it's a roundabout kind of way to answer your question. So just work with me on this.
Absolutely. Okay. I'm with you.
Okay, so one of the things that they'll do too is when I was talking earlier about these early texts, showing all this diversity and these women being there, and life being much messier than we would imagine, given the later texts. What neo-traditionalists do, what contemporary Muslims do, is they read these later texts, and they think those later texts are accurate accounts of how things were, not prescriptive accounts of how things should be. And so in many cases, these texts are saying, this is how Muslims should be, or in some cases, it's been argued with Qushayri's Risala, for instance, which has like pretty much no women in it at all. Women are completely excised from the history of Sufism, that he was writing this he was not doing this for any misogynist purpose to cut women out, but that because there was an enormous amount of hostility to Sufism where he was in Khorasan, and there was real actual physical risk going on, and he was trying to save Sufism through this period, and cutting women out was one of the ways in which you could sort of have Sufism be more acceptable across the board and not cause any controversy. But then people look back and they don't understand or know that context of why there's not women in there, and they just think women are not important to Sufism. Women do not have a voice in Sufism, and that's how it is, and that's right, and that's how it should be. And so neo-traditionalists sort of look at the past and they say, well, that's how it should be. And so that's how we should have things now. So therefore, women in Sufism should not do X, Y, and Z. Women in Islam should not do X, Y, and Z, because they're reading the past in this very romanticized way. And so one of the things that was, here's getting back to your question, as being a practitioner and a scholar, is that as a scholar, you're seeing all this messy history, and you're seeing things that are not comfortable
Right.
to know, and things that that frankly, if you were a person of faith, you can have a really easy time of it by just ignoring all sorts of stuff. If whatever your touch, your triggers are, you can effectively ignore them if you need to, unless there's a compelling reason for you to look at them. And I think we see a lot of Muslims today do a lot of active ignoring of the past, and I don't criticize. I'm not criticizing that at all, because I actually do that now myself, and we can talk about the ways in which I do that. So, I mean, this is part of being religious, is actively ignoring the things that don't feed you, in a way, and that harm your community. But so I'm learning all of these things, and I'm navigating all this, and while I'm doing that, I end up in conversations with other Muslims who are also asking these difficult questions. And I end up sort of leaving conservative Islam as a result, and sort of finding my own way. I got involved with the woman-led prayer movement around the time just before Amina Wadud was leading her historic prayer, and I got involved in that, and tried to organize some woman-led prayers myself with Nikia Jackson. And we were doing this for a little while, until that sort of petered off, because people really weren't ready. One of the women-led prayers we organized, people came and were terrified that anybody would even see them coming.
Mm.
They felt really committed to it, but they were actually afraid of being seen. Which, I mean, just give you an idea of how much control the community had over this idea that a woman could lead prayer, that it was a scandal, of extraordinary proportions, that somebody would be afraid, that somebody in their community would see them going to a location where they might be praying behind a female imam. At this point now, that's much less scandalous in a lot of communities. Still scandalous in many, but much less scandalous in others. People might disagree with you vociferously, but overall, it doesn't have there's not this extraordinary level of fear that there was in the past, at least in the U.S. and Canada in some communities. So I ended up leaving that and exploring Islam in a lot more complicated ways. Like the work of Keisha Ali really opened my eyes up to the legalities around marriage, and the connection between marriage laws and slavery laws, all sorts of ethical issues surrounding slavery in the past, things we also would like to not see and ignore, because it's really uncomfortable to look for Muslims to look at the past and see that. A good friend of mine just found out, she's like, I just found out that Muslims own slaves
Mm.
all these years, and it's like, but she had been able to be Muslim without even knowing that for a long time.
Sure.
And now she's got to struggle with that. And she has to struggle with understanding what her love of God means in this context.
Mm.
And so one of my issues with scholars who don't address this sort of stuff is that they're not helping their congregants, they're not helping the people who read them and interact with them process this difficult stuff in a healthy way. And so people, so there's lots of scholars now who address this stuff in an array of ways, some of which I absolutely 100% disagree with, because it's sort of leaning towards comfort, rather than recognizing the facts of the matter and how the facts actually affect the lives of people today. But they're the leaders of their own communities. They get to make these decisions. I can't make these decisions for them. So there's always been this sort of tension between my faith and my scholarship, and sort of coming to a place where I could love God, like my friend, who's just like, how do I love God knowing all of this? And it's like, where I can love God while thinking through all these historical truths. And really the Sufi core has allowed me to do that. If that starts answering the question, I feel like I could talk about that for about 4 hours.
No, that makes sense. And, I love talking to people who are scholars, but also practice the field that they write about, because I always find their description of finding that balance within those tensions to be just super interesting. And so, like, you've situated yourself spiritually and academically. And whenever you left academia and retired, you have taken to writing novels. I'm curious about that transition from academia into creative writing and writing novels that are, based on your historical areas of expertise, but also rooted within your spiritual path as well. How did that transition go between those two different kinds of writing?
Yeah, I think that the novels are actually, they're a combination of my of many things. So my academic work, my activist work, the spiritual daily work you have to do. Being in a Sufi order is not fun. I mean, there's a lot. It's not all whirling. You know what I mean? Like, you actually
Mm-hmm.
have to work really hard on your soul and be a better person, and it's actually really unpleasant. Um, so we have the good times, we have the we have the good times, we also have the hard times, and also just my love of mysteries and historical mysteries, sort of
Yeah.
pulling all of these things together. And partly what these books are about, what pulls them all together for me, is thinking about how we remember the past. I mean, as an academic, part of what I was asking was, how are we remembering the past? How do we look at the past? How do we read the past in a way? And as a Muslim, I'm thinking about, how do we remember the past, and how does my remembering of the past affect my present? And one of the things I really wanted to ask, and this is also has to do with the context of my activism as well. How do you look at the past? How do you look at the past in a way that allows for the healthiest present, both politically, socially, spiritually, so all the different ways that we can see. So what are the ways in which we remember, when we remember the past differently, when we make certain interpretive choices about the past, what does that mean for our present? And one of the things you can, once you've read a bunch of Quran commentary, or you've read a bunch of hadith, these sayings of Muhammad, the sayings and actions of Muhammad, you know that there are a lot of directions you could take in how you read a particular thing. There's a lot of directions you could take over which report of what Muhammad said or did you decide you're going to act on, and that you're going to hold up over others. So, and the tradition and neo-traditionalists tend to pick things. I mean, okay, let me put it this way: everyone tends to pick the thing that they like, and that supports their own purpose, whatever
Yeah.
their purpose is. And so there are all these different ways of reading the past. But if your purpose is extremely hierarchical, and set to making sure that you preserve a kind of elite control over others, then you're going to read the past in a very different way from somebody who is trying to break down those models of control over others. So there's, like, for instance, right now, my understanding, I want to say this at the outset, I could be completely wrong. I don't know people's intentions of what they're doing. But right now there's a bit of sort of soft apology going on for slavery in the past.
Mm.
And I'm thinking, well, what is it? What is this all about? What is this soft apology going on about slavery? And in part, it has to do with the discomfort we talked about. When you look at your past and you realize there are these difficult things, and leaders have to, in their minds, soft pedal it in a way, and to sort of talk about, look, there were slaves who became leaders, and enslaved men who became leaders, and enslaved women who were the mothers of caliphs, and they had power and they had agency and all these things, which is true and great. But there's also these other elements that give a broader picture to it, that maybe are not as comforting to hear, in that darker skinned slaves tended to be used more in agriculture or backbreaking agricultural labor, this kind of thing. And we're not leading nations, and so what are we remembering, and what are we emphasizing? And so I think these communities tend to emphasize these things in the past because they're trying to guide their followers through these difficult faith moments. But I think, you know, and I'm not going to question them or their followers. I mean, that's not the way I want to do it, but I can see why that works for them. I think socially it's really a problem because it also supports anti-Black racism in the Muslim community, which is rife. So I think there's all sorts of reasons why they shouldn't do that. But again, it's not for me to second guess that. I'm just trying to figure out, like why they're doing that. The other thing that I think it also does for them is that because slavery laws are tied up with marriage laws, and that if you start to question the legalities of slavery, you also end up questioning the legalities of a husband's control over his wife and a man's control over his daughters. And they don't want to do that. Like, they really, really, really don't want to do that. They don't want to create a situation in which right now, within many basic Islamic legal readings, a man can force his wife to have sex. He can rape his wife. But they don't see it as rape. They just see it as like, I have rights over her body in this way. And, oh yes, I should be tender towards her, but, ultimately I can force her. And so there's online discussions of this where you'll have 4 pages saying, don't force her, don't force her, don't force her. And at the end of the 4th page, it says, but you can force her. And so there's this unwillingness to challenge that, even in the most sort of thoughtful responses, which are saying, please don't force her, but they ultimately end up saying, but you can force her. And so I think the discomfort, the unwillingness to challenge slavery has to do with sort of rooted anti-Black racism in the Muslim community, and with a desire to not lose control over what you've got control over, and comfort the community that do this. And so so I'd like to not do that. So I don't want to do that. I don't personally think that that's super healthy for our community. And so my books try to address those kinds of things. My novels try to address all these issues by bringing up the sort of messiness of our past and the diversity of experience of the past, and by bringing these uncomfortable things to light so that people can think about how they're remembering the past, and maybe ask themselves, is there a more ethical way for me to remember our past? Do I have other choices I can make? Is there a story about Muhammad I could choose over another story?
Gotcha.
So there are stories about Muhammad, that could, crack things open in a beautiful way. And there's stories about Muhammad on the same issue that could shut things down. And people make these interpretive choices. So I guess what I'm trying to do in the novels, which is an extension of my academic work and my activism and everything else, is asking people through the process of imagination to imagine a different world in the past that allows you to remember things differently, which allows you to have a different present, that we're not locked into the present that we have. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And, so let's dive into these books a little bit. So I have your 2 books that are out right now. So I have The Lover right here, and I've also got The Jealous sitting right over there on my coffee table. And I'm currently reading The Lover, which is a very fun but also very informative read set in the year 907 CE in Baghdad. And you recognize the challenges and beauties of life when you write. And you have a quote in the book that I loved, which says, none of us escapes getting to know each of God's names, and intimately so. And I absolutely loved that sentence. And I loved learning in the title of the book, which is called The Lover, that one of the names of Allah is the lover. And, many people may know nothing about this bit of Islam, I fully recognize that I don't know much at all. Like, can you describe sort of like the titling of these books, like the names of Allah within Islam, and then like discuss like how you went about like deciding on this title as opposed to like say the other 98 names?
So, so each of the books is named after a name of God that was in use at the time. So it's
So
not
cool.
necessarily they're not necessarily among the traditional 99 names of God. So like the
Yeah.
Jealous is not a traditional 99 name of God, 99 names of God, but it is it is a name that was in use at the time that Sufis talked about.
Mm.
Um, and so uh, and so each one of them. Let me step back for 1 second. It's said that in Islam that when we talk about human beings made in the image of God, what we're saying is that human beings carry the divine qualities within us as potential character traits,
Mm.
and that God displays these names in perfection, and that the Prophet guides us, the Prophet ﷺ guides us towards displaying these names in perfection, but that we display them in all sorts of wild and and inappropriate ways. Like when a child is expressing their greed over a particular object, right? That's a kind of divine character trait of desire and wanting and aggression and all these character traits coming together. But the child is obviously uh, uh, not manifesting those character traits within themselves in a balanced way towards a proper object, in a way that would have the most beautiful outcome. There's that thing that sums it up perfect. There's this really funny Tumblr. I don't even know if it's around anymore, but it was like, stuff that I don't remember exactly what it's called, but it was like stuff that makes my kids cry or something. And it was sort of like, one person had a picture of their kid covered with sunscreen, like, I tried to stop my son from eating sunscreen, and this is why he's having a tantrum, kind of stuff. So it's like you can see in these pictures of these children and the way they're acting actually how we as adults act.
Mm.
So each one of us has in our own way a desire to eat sunscreen, and we get very, very angry when somebody cuts us off from eating the sunscreen that we want, right? It's a new kind of thing. And so part of what we're supposed to be doing as human beings in Islam is rectifying those character traits in a way that we are more in line with God and the Prophet, and
Mm.
the way that those character traits are given in that context. And so we have to reduce our anger, we have to increase our generosity, and all those other things. But in a more complicated way of looking at it, and the way the books look at it, is the names aren't just equal to one another. Some names are actually more expansive and encompassing than
Mm.
other names. So God's mercy, for instance, is one of the most expansive names. So what this means is when God is angry, when God is pulling something from somebody, withholding something from somebody, God is doing it through divine mercy. It's sort of inflected by mercy. So God's wrath is inflected by mercy. It's not like our wrath where
Right.
we just run wild with our wrath. This is actually wrath inflected by mercy. And so one of the things that Sufis do is they heighten love to this all-encompassing level, like mercy, in the sense that everything God does from the spark of creation onward, through every name, no matter how difficult the name is, if it's the compeller, the driver, to the wrathful, to the one who takes vengeance, to the one who forgives, and the one who's gentle and kind and teaches and guides. All of those names are inflected by divine love. And
Mm.
so the job of the human being in the Sufi context is to come to see how all of these names are manifestations of divine love, and to cultivate love within yourself, so that all of those character traits within you are inflected and driven by love,
Mm.
and not driven by base desires, and base impulses. So each one of the books sort of looks at the way in which divine names show up in character traits, and what are the ways in which those names can be mishandled and be driven by base desires, even in the name of God and even in the name of tradition, driven by base desires to control, and versus being being driven by a desire of sacrifice. So one of the things I'm doing in The Jealous is I'm looking. One of the broad themes in The Jealous is, what does it mean to be a man? What is masculinity at that period? And masculinity in that period is driven by this notion of divine jealousy. And that a man following God's divine jealousy is that God is jealous that you should not harm yourself by worshiping other people other than him, that you should not involve yourself in things that are bad for you. And so God punishes you, or God reminds you in ways that maybe are not entirely pleasant, or it reminds you in loving ways and in more comfortable ways that you need to get back. You need to get back and focus on him alone and on the path towards love alone. But when men take this on as a character trait, it doesn't quite have that, that sort of the wisdom driving behind it. It's not necessarily driven in a positive way. It ends up being more an expression of control. It ends up being an expression of control over various people, and that you have this job to be a representative of God, and that the man becomes the ideal representative of God, who then has to control others through jealousy. So the question that I ask in that is there a different characteristic that masculinity can take? And early Sufism provides us with one, which is this concept of ithar, which means self-sacrifice. So what would it be if men's masculinity was driven by the characteristic of self-sacrifice rather than control? And how does that change relationships? And so I try to look at that through the narrative of how Teen is the person who ends up having to sort of confront his masculinity and think through his masculinity in this particular way. And he's guided by the early Sufi Nuri, who's like a father to him, on how he can change himself as a man, and become a person for whom control is not the base point of how his masculinity is expressed.
Okay, so these books are so interesting in the subtle details that you, as a historian of this area of expertise, are able to weave in. And there's something that's very practical within the text, like the little tiny details that you're teaching us as readers along the way. And one of that is about the different calendars that the world runs on. And I'm curious, so this book is set in the year 295, and it says Hijri. What does that mean? What does it mean?
So that's the Muslim dating system.
Yeah, tell us about that.
And I wanted to use the Muslim dating system first, because for me, I felt so I don't have it saying 907 CE,
sure,
and then Hijri. I wanted to put up front that this is a book that's centering Muslim voices and Muslim experience and a Muslim worldview. I didn't want it to be a book that's coming from an outside. It's a very much inside book, and sort of putting that Muslim dating system first before putting the common era date is one of the ways in which I'm trying to sort of center readers and that this is what this world is. Please, I'm trying to build a bridge so that people can come over to our world and live in that world for a bit and see what that world is, and the world in which, when Muslims read it, no matter how they feel about what I've written, and the positions I take in it and that I'm arguing in it, that those are from a voice from within, from a voice that we all encounter and that we are all in conversation with.
Gotcha. Why was the year 295 Hijri chosen for the setting?
Oh, sorry. Yes. So
no, it's fine. I didn't ask
that. That was my area of research.
Nice.
So that's what I knew most about. Like, that was at a prime moment. But I also chose it because I didn't want to look at big political movements. I wanted to focus on the lives of regular people. I wanted to center most stories about the past are about, big historical figures, really important people, and I really wanted to center my stories on regular people, the people who are forgotten from the annals of history or set to the sidelines, and I wanted to center their stories. And if I set the books in times when there was enormous political upheaval, I would end up having to address that political upheaval. There'd just be no way to not do that. So I actually picked that time because it was a period of relative political calm.
Interesting.
And so I picked. So I'm trying to sort of collect these books in a period in which there's relative political calm. So I actually don't have to look at any of those big civilizational questions that are typically more typically the subject of historical fiction.
Is there a name of this era that you're writing about, like 295 Hijri, 907 CE? Is there like an era as like a study of Islamic history that this
Yeah,
is referred to?
everybody disputes this sort of thing. Like, how do periodization, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
periodization is always under dispute. I will call it all sorts of things. I'll call it early Islam, the period of early piety, early Sufism. You can call it the classical period versus the medieval period, which comes a little bit later. Some people will start putting the medieval period at the year 1000 CE. Some people put it a little earlier. What does it even mean to call something medieval? Is that taking something from a Western construct that doesn't work for Islam, et cetera, et
Gotcha.
cetera? So I can't really give you a definitive answer on that,
That's
but it's
fine.
early. It's early. We can call
Cool.
it early.
Nice. So this story, as I mentioned, I'm reading The Lover, and you read a section from The Jealous in the introduction. So, in The Lover, the story is about the death of a servant boy, but your cast of characters is so complex and it's wonderful. So you have this like aloof sheikh and his well-off daughter. You have a policeman who seems to like lack respect in society. You have an old woman. You have poor servants, and like the police officer, he's commenting on class within this book. Like he seems to despise the wealthy whom he sees as openly greedy, lacking in piety. What messages do you as the author see as coming forth regarding social classes in this society from 1100 years ago?
So the police were not respected back then. They were typically thugs. And nobody trusted them. They were, they could be the arm of the caliph, or they could turn around and attack the caliph at the same time. They were a mixed bag. So now I've created, I had to imagine this. This is not a historical thing. The grave crime section, right? Like, this is we investigate murders. We're in the grave crime section of
Yeah.
Baghdad, kind of stuff. So like I've made that up. And I wanted my detectives to be people who had been burned by hierarchies and who had been burned by the system. So my two detectives, Amar and Teen, and Amar is Shia, although at that time the Shia would not be calling themselves Shia, but I needed some kind of shorthand for readers to get that, so I ended up using that term. So Amar is Shia, and Teen is irreligious, and for all sorts of reasons. And both of them were frontier fighters. Now, frontier fighters have enormous respect in Islamic society. They're sort of seen as people who are very much like those who fought alongside Muhammad. But their experience of it is not a good one, right? They have an experience of fighting on the frontier in ways that they see how they were used for the purposes of empire. And they were, and that they're, sort of the lies about doing all of this. Oh, you're doing this for Muhammad, when really you're doing this to prop up a caliphate that you don't even like. And the police are actually an arm of the military. And so Amar gets transferred into, because he makes the mistake of solving a murder within the military. He gets transferred to the Baghdad police for very, very little pay. They got paid next to nothing, for very little pay and no respect. And he ultimately brings his old friend Teen in to work with him, and they come in. So they both have a very strong sense of the corruption, of hierarchical corruption, because they've been party to it. They've killed in ways that they're not that they feel ashamed of. They've propped up governments that they're ashamed of. They've seen how the people who suffer from war are the poor, not the rich. They've seen what society is on its lowest levels, and they can't stand it. And so they're always sort of working from that level. But Amar is also too. So in these books, Zaytuna is the one who's sort of carrying the Sufi path. So her narrative carries the Sufi path of inner transformation. But Amar is actually her parallel, who is experiencing the same exact path of transformation, but through Shia narratives and Shia mythologies and Shia stories about the past. And so Amar sees everything through the social justice lens of Shiism. He sees everything through Karbala. He sees everything through the great heroes of Shiism who spoke to power freely, even if it meant death. Who would not back down. And so he sees himself as a person who has to live up to that truth. So his sense of justice is entirely tied up with Shiism, whereas for Teen, it's more personal. It's about his path, and it's about his history and rectifying his history and repairing his history, as well as knowing the lives of the people who he grew up around and how they've suffered.
Wow. And you also include so many fine and intricate details regarding setting that are so captivating. Like your writings about the courtyards and sleeping on roofs to avoid stifling heat, the houses jammed together in Baghdad. You also describe the materials used by people in their everyday lives, like earthenware. Can you describe your choices as a writer and maybe your fact checking process when fine tuning the setting details for people reading this in 2019, 2020 and beyond? How did you go about getting those small things right?
It took a lot of time and a lot of research. So now, because I had already been doing social history in my work in my work in Sufism, I had already been reading a lot about plagues, about pottery, about clothing, about agriculture, all these things. Of course, I had already been reading a lot about all these things so that I could understand, I could better contextualize the stories that I was reading. But I had to do a lot more research in doing that. And so I had a number of sources that were very helpful for me. The most helpful source for me were the works of El-Jahiz, who's a sort of a, for lack of a better term, a Renaissance man of his day, a man of African and Arab descent, who is just a literateur, if that's the right way to pronounce that. The man you would really like to have at your party because he's hysterically funny, absolutely brilliant, tells extraordinary stories. And so one of his books is really great. It's called the Book of Misers. And it tells stories about cheap people. And so as he's telling stories about cheap people, he's giving all this small social detail. And so he lived, I guess, maybe about 100 or so years before the period of the book. So it gave me a lot of really great fine details for things. Like he talks about a guy who's too cheap to have the dung collector come and clean out the dung catchment for the latrine in his home, to have it done as often as it needs to be. So now I know that there are latrines in rich people's houses, and from his description, how those latrines are, how the stuff gets from the inside to the outside. I know about the catchment, and I know that you have to hire a dung collector to come get it. And then I know that dung collector takes that dung and he drives it into paddy and sells it for fuel, and that human dung fuel was the cheapest form of fuel that you could get. So, from these little things, he also talks about a man who was too cheap to provide rags, like little small rags to wipe your bottom with afterwards. So now I know how people wipe their bottoms. So this is, so doing all this kind of research, was really helped me do it. But there is ultimately, some things are conflicting. So I read things in the bit of the Jealous that I just read. I talked about a man and his sort of comical turban that he has, this extremely large turban.
Yeah.
And I know that that was sort of a point of mockery to have a really, really grand turban was like, you were ridiculous. And And this guy is wearing a turban wrapped around a judge's cap. So initially, I had him just wearing a judge's cap because of something that I had read in some scholarship that said the judges at that period did not wear turbans. They only wore these conical quilted hats.
Mm.
So I didn't have him having a turban around. But then when I sent, because the Jealous actually has some courtroom drama in it, I had sent the courtroom drama scenes to this amazing scholar of Abbasid era courtrooms to look at to make sure I was getting everything accurate. And when he wrote me back, he corrected me on a whole bunch of things I got wrong. So
Sure.
thank God I was able to correct those. But one of the things he corrected me on was that judges wore the conical cap, but with a turban wrapped around it.
Oh my goodness.
He even sent me, manuscript illustration showing it, and the how they sat. That if you were a really humble judge, you wanted to sort of show that you were a very fair, humble person for whom justice was foremost. You would not sit with a backrest. Okay. And so he showed me like look, there are people who used backrests, and there were people who didn't use backrests. And I had people in the courtroom sitting, but nobody would ever sit in the courtroom. They would only stand in front of the judge. Only the judge sits. This kind of thing. These are the things that I had missed entirely that he gave to me. So partly it's research, and partly it is the extraordinary generosity of colleagues like Mathieu Tillier, who gave me these bits and bobs, without which I would get it terribly wrong. And I actually had to not follow some of his advice for the historical moment, because my courtroom scene would have been incredibly boring if I made the courtroom scene historical to the period. So he sort of helped me come up with a way to make my judge do things a little differently that would still be sort of historically functional, even if it wasn't
Sure.
completely accurate to the period. So yeah, it's really hard work getting all those little things right. I mean, and now being on Twitter, it's amazing. There's all these historians on Twitter who are doing these great threads about inks, about the kinds of pottery. I was just reading one the other day about molded pottery, and that
Yeah.
the poor would have had molded pottery. And I was like, wow, I didn't even know that. And I feel like I made a mistake in the Jealous, because I described some earthenware as red, when red would have meant under firing.
Oh,
And I didn't
interesting.
and I didn't know that, actually, that it
Yeah.
had been under fired. And so then I'm like, actually it should have been yellow if it had been, buff colored and things like this. So I do still make some little mistakes, but I
Sure.
don't think it interferes with the reading overall.
Yeah.
Um, and hopefully I'll correct those things in the future.
I
But because
love
I'm
it.
self-published, I can always just go back and change the word.
Oh, that's so cool. Well, and you also included some details about something, that Sunni Shia schism within Islam, which is something that people in the world are still, trying to grasp on a basic level even today. Um, how do you feel the history you include in your book could help people come to better understand the nuance of this schism in our world today?
So one of the things that I'm trying to show is that things were too messy for there to be schisms
Mm,
in the way that we think of them now. Like
okay.
we think of Sunni and Shia as being this binary within Islam. And I don't want to comment on whether or not it's really a binary in Islam now. I think it's less of a binary than people think. And I think scholars argue that right now, that it's less of a binary than we think. Uh, but that there are all these differences and arguments going on. I mean, one of the things that, oh my God, her name, it's not coming to me. And I was just reading her work. She's talking about how, about how Sunnis are always going to Shia pilgrimage sites,
Mm,
in the past. And this is not they weren't Shia pilgrimage sites. They were the pilgrimage sites of shared heroes of Islam. So the prophet's family and these great these people who stood up for justice, these are shared heroes. But
mm,
Sunnis and Shias do remember these shared heroes differently. Okay, and
interesting.
that's the difference, is that they have all of these, we have all these shared figures, but we remember them very differently. We talk about them very differently, and we remember them for ourselves and for our own actions differently. And then within Sunni Islam and then within Shia Islam now, there are also all these different forms of Sunnis, there are all these different forms of Shia, and everybody's remembering everything differently. And then you have the personal remembering being different, right? So even just one person remembers things differently from another person. And back then, things were fabulously messy. We don't have Shia and Sunni, we have proto-Shia, proto-Sunni, for lack of better terms, in which these communities are developing and sort of finding their identities. There was, people were really differing at that point in time of, who was the correct Shia imam. This is what I'm sort of looking at in the third book called The Unseen, as I'm focusing on this period of Shiism where there was a great deal of dispute about who properly inherited the imamate, and what the imamate even entailed at this point of time. And so they hadn't even really decided at this point, like it hadn't really the idea had not yet coalesced that what we think of as Twelver Shiism, which are the majority Shias now, were actually the minority then. And the idea was just coalescing that this imam was the imam of to the end of days, and that he would have this extremely prolonged life in this sort of unseen capacity. That was still sort of in formation at this time. So it's really difficult to talk about sectarianism or schism at this point when sort of everybody was in dispute with everybody else about everything.
Yeah.
And one of the things I'm trying to show in The Lover are the ways in which Sufis are all disputing with one another. Once you start studying Sufism, like, look, if you're a Sufi today, you read all these stories, oh, love this, and you think everybody gets along, and then you start reading these early Sufi things where people are arguing with each other, like this theological point matters, and this theological point matters because I have a direct experience with God that tells me that this is right. And somebody else is like, yeah, well, not exactly right.
Yeah.
Because I have a similar experience of God, but it's got this tweak on it. Or we have a similar experience of God, and I think we shouldn't talk aloud about it, but you're out in the streets talking about it, threatening us all. And there's all these disputes. And how do you take up the path? Do you focus on your soul, or do you look solely at God? Should you be fasting these days? All these different kinds of, and people are fighting with each other, and everybody talks about, Rumi and Shams and stuff, but Shams was really this wild sort of figure, almost like a motorcycle tough, right? And this guy, at one point he has this great line where he says, my station is so high with God that if you looked up at me, your turban would fall off your head. Right? So you have so I'm trying to sort of bring to life all that sort of extraordinary diversity, all the disputes, all the feelings. But what I'm really, really trying to do is take it out of the air of rarefied discourse and doctrine and bring it down to the lives of people.
Yeah.
What does doctrine mean in the lived experience? And so for me, all these books, everything I'm writing is all about how we remember the past in order to understand, we're looking at doctrine in this very rarefied, text-heavy, elitist kind of way, and not talking about experience.
Yeah.
So we can have these conversations about how, well, consent's a modern notion and it didn't exist in the past, therefore, there was no bad experience about, they would have experienced things differently. And it's like, well, let's talk about the diversity of experience. And I have primary sources from the past in which women are not talking happily about having to be forced to have sex with their husbands when they don't want to.
Right.
So clearly women at the past were having an experience of this, of being forced to have sex with their husbands, that even though they had no expectation of consent.
Right.
But if we stick to these elite doctrines and we talk about things on in this elite kind of concept, well, what are the ideals of slavery in the past? Well, slavery in Islam was meant to be, so much better. It's not chattel slavery. It's all these other kinds of things. But then we forget about the experience of people. And that experience was diverse and not always good. And we need to see, what doctrine is for people. So partly what I'm trying to do as an academic who really fell in love with social history, as an activist who wants people to to find the most ethical possible way of living their Islam, and as a practitioner who's trying to do the same, I'm really trying to sort of bring these stories down to experience. And you can do that through narrative. You can bring people into the lives of others and have them think through how doctrine, how big ideas, how history works in the lives of people. And then, maybe that will give them some way of perceiving the world differently, and maybe making choices differently, and maybe, helping people understand the history of Islam a little in a bit more of a nuanced way. So the lover gets used in a lot of classrooms. It's been used in over 20 classrooms now as an introductory text, because it really brings the diversity of this world and these doctrines, and the infighting and the beauty and all the good stuff. Everything is there in detail, and sort of really brings to life that stuff. And I hope the Jealous will be used the same. Courses about ethics, about masculinity, gender, slavery, any of these kinds of issues that get raised in that book. I hope will be done. But really, it's all about how do we remember? The act of remembering is really what the books are about for me.
Well, I know I found your work because of Dr. Elise Morgenstein first, chatting about how much she liked your books on Twitter. So that's how I originally found you, was via Twitter from a scholar whose work I follow. And so that's how we came to be doing this today, It's so cool.
She gave my book to her dad to read.
Awesome.
Like, wow, that's it. That's the thing. That's it.
Amazing.
Right there. You gave my book to your dad to read. Yeah.
So
Lisa, great.
You've got this like big scope for this in mind. Like, I've got the lover here. I've got the Jealous sitting across from me on the coffee table. You mentioned a third book. Tell me about the scope of these writing plans you've got.
Yeah, this series has 4 books in it total. So it's following Zaytuna and Amar's spiritual path.
Okay.
And they will both sort of, get to where they need to be by the 4th book. And then I need to stop writing the series because it is a lot of work. The research involved in writing these books is daunting. It's an enormous amount of work. And now that I'm kind of doing this as a part-time job, frankly, you can't make money if you're only putting out 1 book a year. And I can only put out 1 book a year with these books because there's just so much research.
Sure.
So I've actually plotted the first book in a different series that should be much easier to write because it's completely made up.
Awesome.
And it's in an alternative medieval timeline in which I've imagined that at the time, like these books are, so sort of around 300 years after the prophet, a plague hits, and it's an apocalyptic plague that changes the world forever. And
sounds familiar.
Yeah, I know, right? So I'm kind of imagining that. And I've also been following all these really amazing plague scholars on academic Twitter. So that really informed a lot of it. And so it's this 1,000-year period of chaos in which they're ultimately sort of brought out of this period of chaos, but they're still sort of in this medieval alternative timeline. And so, and it's got some speculative fiction aspects to it.
Love that.
My detective is a middle-aged noir kind of detective. She's bitter and unhappy. She has the, as all noir detectives needs to be. And she's an interesting character. She's inherited, her name's Daria Mack, and she's inherited the ability to hear all creatures praising God because she comes from a long line of mystics. And so she's born with this capacity. But because of the plague, her family has died. She has no guidance in learning how to control and live with this voice. And so she's nearly driven mad by it. And so the story sort of shows her later in life, but we find out how it was that she ultimately came to learn how to control these voices and sounds. Her best friend is a fallen angel with a Cassandra complex. So, in Islam, one of the things that the angels do is they, in the Quran, they warn God. They say, hey, you don't want to make these human beings because they're gonna create problems. And God's like, look, I know better than you. I know better than you. I know what's going to happen. Don't you tell me they're going to make trouble. I know they're going to make trouble, but I know better than you how this is going to turn out. So my fallen angel by the name of Frankie, is this fallen angel. He's not a he, he's a they, because angels don't have gender. So he's a they, and Frankie had, ended up in this fight with God, saying, I'm not with you on this. I'm out of here. These human beings are terrible. And so Frankie, so they have this sort of Cassandra complex about things. And Frankie's also very disturbed because nobody tells stories about Frankie's fallenness the way they do about other fallen angels who, the storytellers regale their histories, and Frankie's unknown. So Frankie's very bitter and Daria's best friend. And then there's a Jinn woman who runs a tavern, sort of a Wild West tavern brothel kind of thing. I'm just going wild with this at this point, sort of building it out. But I plotted the first book. And I'm just trying to get to a place where I could probably maybe write 3 of those a year.
Wow.
This is, if make any money self-publishing, you have to write 4 books a year. And I can't imagine being able to do that. So if I could ever ramp up to 3 books a year, that would be super great. But if I can get these to two books a year, I'll be happy with myself. So I'm trying to sort of build these stories out, build these characters out. And look at some interesting questions in those, but not historical, so that I just don't fret and lose my mind over making a mistake.
Yeah.
As I'm doing in these books.
Gotcha. Well, Dr. Laury Silvers, you've got a magnificent amount of writing ahead of you and behind you. The Lover, The Jealous, the forthcoming couple of other books in that series, as well as your second series in development. If people want to find you and follow along with what it is that you are up to, which is a lot, where can they find you?
So my website is very detailed, and I can see who visits what pages, and mostly people just visit the first page of my website. But there are a lot of really detailed historical pages in there about the history of the history in the books, where I diverge, what choices I've made, why I've made the choices I've made.
You have reading guides.
And reading guides, both teaching guides for professors who want to teach The Lover or who want to teach The Jealous, with sample assignments, all of that. And that's at www.llsilvers.com.
Awesome.
And so people can find me there. I'm on Twitter as Waraka Musa. Let me spell that, WARAQAMUSA.
Excellent.
And I have an Instagram account, but I just cannot wrap my head around Instagram. I just cannot figure out what I'm supposed to be doing on it.
Is it the same username as Twitter?
No, I think that's Laury L. Silvers.
Okay, cool. Maybe I'll follow you there.
But I literally do not post anything. And then every once in a while people remind me, you have to post on Instagram, and then I make something and I post it. I can't figure it out. You
need to do TikTok as well, because that'll get you thousands of views in a single day.
Apparently, but does it sell books? This is what I want to know. I want to hear from somebody who's doing TikTok videos, who's actually seeing increased sales.
You need to find Andrew Mark Henry, who does the Religion for Breakfast series, and ask him, because he's gotten tens of thousands of followers on TikTok in a very short amount of time.
Well, okay. Well, you know what? I have, performance in my past. So, if I could, maybe figure out how to do something ridiculous and not be completely stupid about it, maybe I'll figure that out. Yeah, promotion is really a crazy thing, you just kind of want you kind of want to write books and then just live in your hole and not do any promotion and just let people find the books. But unfortunately, that's not real.
It's not the way it works. Well, no. Dr. Laury Silvers, thank you for coming on the show and promoting your books. This has been a wonderful conversation. I've loved hearing your behind the scenes descriptions of how you've gone together, putting together these books, and as well as your future plans. This is very exciting. And so I would highly encourage everybody to check out the books. I'm loving reading it in my beautiful summery backyard here in Buffalo, New York. And they're keeping me company in a time when I really can't get out all that much. So I'm grateful to you for the entertainment, but also the education. So everybody should check these out. And just thank you so much for coming on the show. And I would love to have you back someday.
Thank you so much for the conversation. It was a lot of fun. Very much, I really enjoyed it. You're a wonderful interviewer.
Classical Ideas is produced by me, Greg Soden. Music on Classical Ideas is composed and performed by Derek Strybeck. You can find his music at www.wearewarmmusic.com. If you like this show, please rate it on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email me at classicalideas@outlook.com or find me on Patreon at patreon.com/classicalideaspodcast. Thanks so much for listening.